Good evening.
Thank you for joining us and welcome to the first night of the 49th Annual Impact Symposium, Rise of the Rest, What is the Future of American Foreign Policy?
Traditionally, the Vanderbilt University Speakers Committee is charged with the task of selecting a topic that addresses issues important to students and faculty alike. We strive to expand upon what is taught in the classroom and challenge that which is blindly accepted. Since 1964, influential and oft controversial figures, ranging from Martin Luther King to George Wallace, from Bobby Kennedy to Gerald Ford, have graced Vanderbilt's campus to do just that, enhance Vanderbilt's academic and cultural ethos.
In years past, we have kept an eye towards domestic policy by asking, what is the future of capitalism and the future of the middle class? However, the ever-changing geopolitical landscape epitomized by the Arab Spring has required us to turn our gaze towards affairs beyond our borders.
Defined by Fareed Zakaria as the rise of the rest, accelerated growth in the developing world has resulted in a global social, cultural, and economic convergence with the United States. This has proven to be a destabilizing force to traditional geopolitics, resulting in whispers about the demise of American power abroad. With such political and economic uncertainty, the Vanderbilt University Speakers Committee has targeted the future of foreign policy as an exceedingly appropriate theme for this year's Impact.
To appropriately ask such an abstract question, we sought to populate the stage with political leaders from across the ideological and geographical spectrum. Over the next 3 days, members of the Vanderbilt student body and Nashville community will have the opportunity to interact with such renowned leaders as Governor John Huntsman, General Wesley Clark, President Vicente Fox, Governor Bill Richardson, and tonight, the Senator of Tennessee, Lamar Alexander. John G. Geer, the Gertrude Conway Vanderbilt Professor of Political Science, will be introducing Senator Alexander. As a chair of the Political Science Department, Distinguished Professor of Public Policy and Education, and the co-director of the Center for the Study of Democratic Institutions, John has a wealth of knowledge upon which to draw. We once again thank you for coming and ask that you join us in welcoming Professor John Geer.
Thank you.
Well, thank you, David and Danielle. I appreciate that. And I appreciate the opportunity to introduce the senator from Tennessee. I mean, this is an honor in many, many different regards. And frankly, anything I say today certainly does not do justice to his many, many accomplishments. And the facts are that the citizens of this state and the citizens of this nation have been the beneficiaries of his many accomplishments. And fortunately, we are in the position to continue to benefit from those accomplishments as he serves us in the United States Senate. Let me just list a few things on this remarkable career of Senator Alexander's. First of all, and I have to start, of course, with the fact that in 1962, he graduated from this fine university and therefore is an alum of Vanderbilt and something that the university treasures because of his many accomplishments and what he's done for the university and for the nation. He was two-term governor of the state from 1979 to 1987. In fact, just recently donated his papers that were tied to that time in office to the Hurd Library, which is a resource that scholars will be able to certainly make great use of. And for those of you with kind of an historical memory, you'll know that he came into office under difficult times because of a scandal of his predecessor and actually took office a couple of days early, again rose to the occasion and served our state well. Then following his time as governor, he was president of the University of Tennessee and then served under George H.W. Bush's Secretary of Education. Of course, most recently, he has been our senator since 2003, re-elected by a very comfortable margin this last time around because of his popularity in the state and his successes on so many different fronts. And I do want to say that he was also elected to the Vanderbilt Hall of Fame, Athletic Hall of Fame in 2011. In fact, I was in the audience when that took forward. It was a really nice moment, and again, a sign of his many, many breadths of accomplishments. And he's worked on so many issues, ranging from education to the environment, to energy, to, you can just name them. But what I want to end with, and let obviously the senator speak, not me, is that in today's politics, We are facing a polarized environment. We are facing people who kind of have red-colored glasses or have blue-colored glasses, and that we are facing a very stark reality that's causing conflict and disagreement, and we have many people who are engaged in partisanship and fighting and bickering, and we do not have people who reach across the aisle or people who try to do the right kind of thing. But in fact, we have that in Senator Alexander. We have somebody who rises above partisan politics, who tries to do the right things, who builds the bridges to the other side, because there are good policy solutions out there, and it takes people of goodwill, of which he's one of them, to help make those kinds of things happen. So for those of you who have your partisan lenses, your partisan glasses, if you will, whether they're red or they're blue, I would recommend that you take them off tonight and listen to his good words. Perhaps we should have plaid glasses, given his own personal history. But nonetheless, I think it's important to realize that this is not a partisan talk, that the ideas that he will express today are based on evidence and logic, not partisanship and spin. And it is for those reasons that the Impact Symposium and all the people who worked hard made a very wise choice in bringing the senator to speak to us today. And so with no further ado, please welcome Senator Lamar Alexander.
Thank you, John. That was very generous. Thanks very, very much for your leadership at Vanderbilt and for the introduction. And David and Danielle, thank you for inviting me and for putting together a tremendous program for these next few nights. I'm back at Vanderbilt quite a bit, and I don't live far from here. But coming here tonight brings back a lot of Vanderbilt memories. I was editor of The Hustler, and it came out once a week in those days. Sometimes late at night, we would get out on the balcony of the third floor of Kirkland Hall and make speeches in Spanish, or what we thought passed for Spanish, to students down below who didn't have any idea what might be going on. Then I'd borrow my roommate's motorcycle and drive down to Benson Printing Company with the newspaper, which would be printed and distributed on Friday. Those were the days of the typical Vanderbilt co-ed, the TVCs, as we call them. Those were the days when some of the alumni at Dr. Geer said that there were communists in the political science department, which made us want to go hear what they had to say. This were the days when the student body voted down desegregating the undergraduate school at Vanderbilt in a referendum, which was provoked by a number of us who were students then, and then the Board of Trust reacted by opening up the undergraduate school. Those were the days of struggling football teams, great basketball teams, and when tuition went from $600 a semester to $900 a semester, causing great consternation in families all across the country who were trying to pay it. Even back then, as already been mentioned, there was Impact, which started in the mid-'60s, but the speakers that I remember back then were more controversial than the crowd you've lined up for the next few days. Those you've gotten, I mean the ones that follow me, are a very tame but distinguished group of speakers. We had the poet Allen Ginsberg, who stayed up late telling dirty stories to Vanderbilt co-eds in the dormitories. Stokely Carmichael, who came a few years after the Nashville sit-in. So this is a little bit different group you've got this week. Former ambassadors, cabinet secretaries, generals, all of whom can be considered to be genuine experts on foreign policy, which is a subject that you've chosen. I am not an expert on foreign policy, but I do know one thing, and that is this, that foreign policy is energy policy. Or say it the other way, energy policy is foreign policy. The future of American foreign policy, your subject, depends upon the future of energy policy, both at home and around the world. So tonight I want to talk about, as a prelude to what you're going to hear from these distinguished speakers over the next few days, how energy policy affects the future of American foreign policy. When I was governor, I made a speech up in East Tennessee, and my late friend Alex Haley, the author of Roots, was there, and he came up afterwards. He asked if he could say something to me privately, and I said, of course. He said, may I suggest that if you'd open your speeches by saying, instead of making a speech, I'd like to tell you a story, somebody might actually listen to what you have to say. I thought that was pretty good advice from Alex Haley. So let me tell you a story to open my remarks tonight. I'm going to borrow the story, or at least the idea of it, from the prologue of Daniel Yergin's The Quest. Now, Daniel Yergin is the best historian, in my view, of energy in the United States and really the world. And his two books, The Prize, which won the Pulitzer Prize a few years ago, and The Quest, which came out this month, are really two of the best history books of any kind over the last 25 years. Now the story. It was January 16, 1991. I was at a meeting in the cabinet room in the White House on the subject of educational assessments. It was a dull meeting, even though it was presided over by the President of the United States, George H.W. Bush. It was hard to stay awake. In December, President Bush had appointed me nominated me as Education Secretary. I was then President of the University of Tennessee. During the meeting, I think it was about halfway through, President Bush excused himself for about 10 minutes and went out, came back, and continued to preside over the meeting, which ended, as I remember, about 3:30. I went to the airport with some friends of mine and colleagues who I was recruiting to the education department, and we flew to Knoxville, where we were going to spend 2 or 3 days developing our education policy. But when we landed at the Knoxville airport about 7 p.m., everybody was focused on the television sets. Marlin Fitzwater, the president's press secretary, was saying, "The liberation of Kuwait has begun." U.S. airplanes were attacking Baghdad, Kuwait, and other Iraqi military targets. We learned later that President Bush had excused himself for 10 minutes from our meeting on assessments so he could telephone Gorbachev and tell him the bombing was going to start in a few hours. Our meeting had been very visibly on the President's public schedule, and I assume the reason was to suggest to the world that if the President was presiding over a dull education assessment meeting, he was not about to launch a war. But he did that. There was a coalition of 36 nations in troops and money, including Saudi Arabia, not far away, Russia, Japan. The number of forces on the ground was nearly 1 million. The war was paid for not just by the United States, but mostly by other countries in the coalition. The United Nations gave its permission for the effort. The ground war began on February 23rd. The ceasefire began 4 days later on February 27, and by March 8, troops began coming home. What caused this extraordinary event? The answer is energy, specifically oil. Saddam Hussein had said that Kuwait was producing too much oil, driving down the price, he said, to unbearable levels. In other words, cutting the amount of money that Saddam Hussein could get from Iraqi oil. Saddam's goal was simple: annex Kuwait, wipe it off the map. And as Daniel Yergin said, an Iraq that subsumed Kuwait would rival Saudi Arabia as an oil power with far-reaching impact on the rest of the world. Many consequences came from that war that affected foreign policy. Just one was that in September 1993, the Palestinian Liberation Organization saw what had happened, had meetings with then-President Clinton, signed the Oslo Accords. Arafat and Rabin shook hands, agreed on a two-state solution, and were awarded Nobel Peace Prizes. Energy policy is foreign policy. Former Secretary of State Condi Rice, who's now back teaching at Stanford, said when oil prices, gasoline prices, rose to $1.40 a barrel for oil in 2008, she said this: "I've never seen anything warp diplomacy like high oil prices." That was Condi Rice. So how do you keep oil prices from warping diplomacy? Many suggest energy independence. And how does a country like the United States, which uses 1/4 of all the energy in the world — now remember, we only have 4 or 5% of the people in the world, but we produce about a quarter of all the wealth in the world, and we use about a quarter of all the energy in the world to do that. There's only one way to develop energy independence, in my view, and that's 4 words: find more, use less. The economics professors here tonight will say that's Economics 101, supply and demand. Find more, use less. And we should know how to do that in our country. Our secret weapon is innovation and research. It's hard to think of an advance in the physical and biological sciences since World War II that hasn't been partially funded by the government and had some participation by our 17 great national laboratories and our wonderful research universities like Vanderbilt. We're the world's leader in innovation and research, which is why I've proposed for the United States a new Manhattan Project for clean energy independence, which leads me to another story. Early in World War II, President Roosevelt called the chairman of the United States Senate Appropriations Committee to the Oval Office. That chairman was Kenneth B. McKellar, a Tennessean. The president said to McKellar, "Mr. Chairman, I need to hide $1 billion in the federal budget for a secret project to win the war." Senator McKellar said, "That should be no problem, Mr. President. I only have one question. Where in Tennessee will that project be?" Well, that gave rise to Oak Ridge. And Oak Ridge was part of the original Manhattan Project, along with about 30 sites around the world, that devoted enormous focus and determination, probably the greatest concentration of scientific know-how in one direction toward building 2 bombs to win the war before Germany did and took the United States hostage. That's why I suggest that we need several mini-Manhattan projects to find new forms of energy and new forms of energy efficiency to give us the kind of energy independence that will relieve us from energy dependence affecting and warping our foreign policy. Use our secret weapons, the labs and the universities, for example, to find a way to produce solar power at less than $1 a watt installed, or a battery that'll take an electric car 300 miles and that you can buy for $20,000, or to recapture carbon from coal plants. We know how to get rid of the sulfur, nitrogen, and mercury. We haven't got a commercial way to get rid of the carbon. Or to make biofuels from crops we don't eat, not from corn, because it drives up the price of food so much around the world. To find better ways to dispose of used nuclear fuel, better ways to build green buildings. Daniel Yergin says we're twice as efficient today in the use of energy as we were in the 1970s. We can probably double that again. And then, as a long-term choice, perhaps fusion. Let's just take one example of what this kind of mini-Manhattan project might be. In the 1967 movie, The Graduate, Mr. McGuire, a businessman, takes young Dustin Hoffman off to the side and whispers in his ear the one word that will secure his economic future, and the word is plastics. Today, if Mr. McGuire were to whisper to you one word, he might whisper batteries. So I'll start with a story of a man who made $1 billion one way and suggest you might be able to make $2 billion with the one word batteries. This is a man who sent his children to Vanderbilt, Ross Perot. In the 1960s, he was living in Dallas. Mr. Perot noticed that all the banks had these big new computers. They were very large back then, and the banks locked their door at 5 o'clock, and they locked the computer doors as well. So Perot went around to all the banks and said, "I'll pay you for your unused computer time at night." Then he came to states like Tennessee, this was long before I was governor, and said, "I've got a lot of cheap computer time, you've got a lot of data, I can manage it cheaper than anybody else can," and Perot made $1 billion. Now, here's how you could do it. The greatest untapped resource in America today is our capacity to make electricity at night. Think about that. We're asleep at night, we're not working at night, and these big plants that we've built aren't producing nearly as much as they could. One estimate is that we have about 60 nuclear power plants worth of unused electrical capacity at night, just as we had all that computer time unused in the banks. What could we do with all that unused electrical capacity? Plug in electric cars and trucks at night is one thing we could do with it. For the last couple of years, I've driven a Prius modified with an A123 battery. Today, I drive an electric Leaf, all of which will be made in Smyrna, Tennessee, after a year or so. I enjoy paying about $8 for the equivalent of driving 300 miles to buy electricity instead of $80 for the equivalent of filling up with gasoline to drive 300 miles. We could electrify 1/3 of all of our cars and trucks by plugging them in at night without building one new power plant if we could make all the pieces fit. That's not such a new idea. Daniel Yergin says that 100 years ago there were more electric cars on the streets of New York than there were internal combustion engines, but the internal combustion engines won out and the electric cars didn't. And Yergin also says that we're not likely to have 20% of all of our cars, or 30 or 40% in the near future, be electric. He suggests it might be only 3% by the year 2020. But 3% of all of our cars and light trucks is about 4 million cars in the United States. We have a lot of cars and trucks. For Tennessee, it's about 80,000. For the Nashville media market, it's about 30,000. Carlos Ghosn, who's the CEO of Renault and Nissan, has bet his company's future on these electric cars. Just last week, the Energy Department announced that a small company had doubled the density of a lithium-ion battery, which could hasten the day when we have a car that will go 300 miles on one charge and that you can buy for $20,000 instead of $30,000. Then our technology and our innovation will reduce our energy dependence, lower our fuel prices, and free our foreign policy to be determined more on foreign policy ideas. That would reduce our use of oil by a third, or by about the amount of oil we import from overseas. It would stop shipping hundreds of billions of dollars overseas. It would help clean up our air. It would raise family incomes. Foreign policy is energy policy. Now, one more story, and this one is close to home, to illustrate the difficulty of energy independence, particularly focusing on renewable energies, which are so popular today. President Obama, in his inaugural address, talked about powering our country on the sun, the wind, and the earth. Now he's changed his tune quite a bit. Secretary Chu, the Nobel Prize-winning energy secretary, has helped to persuade him to do that. So the president today supports nuclear power. He talks about all of the above. He's taken credit for new discoveries of natural gas and new production of oil. He sees what's really necessary to be able to power a country that uses 25% of all the energy in the world, although he's continued to push for sun and wind and earth and energy that comes from there. But let me give you an example of how difficult that is for a big country like ours. This is very close to home. Some of you may know where Love Circle is. It's a big hill nearby. John Rich has a house there. Lovers like to park there and look at the lights. Vanderbilt and the Metro Water Services are going to build a large 78-foot wind turbine there. It will be about as tall as the Parthenon is tall. Here's my view of it. It would take about 1.1 million of what I consider to be an eyesore to equal the production of the electricity produced by the new nuclear power plant being built at Watts Bar. That would be a number of 80-foot tall wind turbines that would go all the way around the earth and then some in order to equal that. And to build those turbines would cost about 15 times the amount that it costs to build the nuclear power plant, and you'd still need the nuclear power plant because the wind only blows about a third of the time. Much of that is at night when you don't need it, and you can't store it if you don't use it. So that's a problem with renewable energy. It's the scale problem. And it's a problem that in the name of saving the environment, too often these projects are of such large scale, they destroy the environment. Just to give you one more example involving the difficulty with wind, 4 nuclear reactors on 4 square miles would equal the amount of production that you'd get from lining up large wind turbines. These are very big turbines, 3 times as tall as Neyland Stadium at the University of Tennessee, for any of you who really follow football very closely. You'd have to line up turbines of that size for 2,178 miles along the whole Appalachian Trail from Maine to Georgia to equal 4 nuclear power plants or 5 or 6 natural gas plants. Biomass, which is promising in smaller amounts, has the same problem. A 100 megawatt biomass plant, which is about 1/12 the size of a nuclear plant or about 1/8 the size of a natural gas plant, you'd have to continuously forest an area 1.5 times the size of the Great Smoky Mountains in order to produce an equivalent amount of electricity. The renewable energy, to me, which seems to be the most promising, is solar, because we have rooftops, and that provides a place to put lots of solar power. Plus, the sun shines at a time when we need extra electricity, not at night. My concluding example of innovation and energy independence is the most remarkable development in our country and around the world in the last 20 years, although we've just begun to learn about it in the last year or two, and that is shale gas, a new way of mining or actually finding natural gas. I can very well remember in 2005 when we passed the last big comprehensive energy law that we thought about calling it a Natural Gas Act of 2005. Because natural gas prices were at $15 a unit. Companies like Eastman Chemical and Dow Chemical were thinking of moving overseas and taking their jobs with them because of the high cost of the raw material that they need, natural gas. And farmers were complaining about the high cost of fertilizer. Natural gas is important to that. Older people couldn't afford to heat their homes or to cool their homes. And auto manufacturers and suppliers who were thinking about whether to come to Tennessee or Mexico or some other country were having to factor in the higher cost of energy caused by this very expensive gas. Yet just 7 years later, the cost has gone down to closer to $2 a unit instead of $15, and the United States suddenly finds itself in a position where natural gas for us seems to have a 100-year supply, and the price that we'll pay for it seems to be our local price, not a world price, and it puts us in the position of being able suddenly to lure jobs back here. We had a Vanderbilt forum last week at the business school where we reviewed all of the implications of the auto industry coming to Tennessee, which began with Nissan coming from Japan and making here what they sell here. There was a matter of great foreign policy importance in the early part of the Carter administration, where he said to Japan, if you're going to sell your cars here, you're going to have to make them here. The same thing that Brazil is saying to Mexico today, 30 years later. And we reviewed, why did those auto companies come to Tennessee at a time when there weren't any auto jobs in Tennessee, and today they're 30% of our manufacturing jobs? Well, the answers are familiar. One is central location. I used to take a map of the United States, really a photograph of the United States taken at night from a satellite. And when the Japanese would ask me where Tennessee is, I would say right in the middle of the lights. That made a lot of difference because if you're making big, heavy things like cars and trucks, you want your transportation costs to be as low as possible. It helps to be right in the center of the population, and Tennessee was. But in addition to that, there was a right-to-work law. No state north of us had a right-to-work law. That was important. Another thing that we learned was good highways were important, so we had 3 big road programs because suppliers want to be near the assembly plant. But today there's a couple of other things that have come into play. One is currency. There's another factor in foreign policy and that has a factor on foreign policy. The currency advantage here makes it cheaper for General Motors and Nissan to build cars here and even sell them back in Korea or in Japan. And now low energy costs. Many of the companies that came to Tennessee came because the Tennessee Valley Authority offered large amounts of reliable, low-cost electricity. That's been getting higher. But suddenly, if low-cost energy can add to the other factors and make Tennessee and surrounding states a good place for manufacturing, that's going to tip the balance in bringing manufacturing home. So energy policy, once more, is foreign policy because a supply of low-cost clean energy can have so much to do with jobs and the strength of the economy, and countries that are strong and independent in their economy and in their energy policy find that it doesn't warp diplomacy in the way Condi Rice talks about. So this week, as you listen to the real experts who discuss the future of foreign policy, from the former president of Mexico to the general to the ambassadors, I hope you'll be thinking of questions like, will the Middle East be selling more of its oil west instead of east? It has about a quarter of all the, it produces about a quarter of all the oil in the world, has 60% of the proven resources, but if it sells it west to China, et cetera, instead of east, will China and Japan and the Asian countries be more dependent upon the Middle East, and will we be less dependent? That will have something to do with our foreign policy. What will that mean, for example, to Japan and China's willingness to impose sanctions on Iran for building nuclear weapons if they depend upon the Middle East more for their energy? And will we in the United States be able to find so much more energy at home or from Canada and Mexico and even Brazil that we'll be relatively more independent, so it won't be possible for other countries to, in effect, hold us hostage, and our foreign policy won't be so warped by the price of oil or the price of energy? And are there new forms of energy and new forms of using energy efficiently that will propel us in that way? And if Japan doesn't open its nuclear plants after the tragedy last year, Japan closed all but 3 of its 54 nuclear plants, which provide 30% of its electricity. So you have auto plants operating on weekends. You have thermostats set to 85 in the summer, and their summers are hot as ours. You have the emperor and the empress wandering around the imperial palace with a candle to set a good example. Can a big economy survive that sort of energy policy? And if the economy of Japan weakens and Japan weakens, what will that do to China's interest in being more dominant in Asia? Or another question, will Russia continue to use its natural gas to bully its neighbors? Foreign policy is about reducing conflict and encouraging peace. And the most promising strategy for reducing poverty, reducing conflict, and encouraging peace around the world is a new Manhattan Project for clean energy independence, using our secret weapons, our research universities and national laboratories, to discover transforming innovations that will provide unlimited, cheap, clean energy that eventually becomes available in every country. That's why you really can't have an impact forum on the future of American foreign policy without a discussion of energy. Foreign policy is energy policy. Thank you.
Senator, I want to add one thing to your history of Impact. I was here in 1964, and the first keynote speaker at Impact was not a controversial politician, but like you, he was an editor and a Vanderbilt student. He was Ralph McGill, the distinguished progressive editor of the Atlanta Constitution. Unlike you, he never graduated from Vanderbilt because he got expelled. My question for you is not in energy policy directly, but it affects that. It's more in the political realm. Do you see a realistic path forward to a less divisive Washington situation, and a government that can more effectively deal with many of these issues that face this country?
The short answer is yes, I do. I think that we have to deal with them. We have big issues to deal with. We see them in foreign policy. You'll be talking about them this week. The president's got his hands full around the world. If he had nothing to do at home, and at home he's got a government that's borrowing 40 cents of every dollar it spends, and a whole variety of issues. So yes, I do. And I think most of the senators that I work with want to see that happen. And they would agree with you that the Senate is not as functional as it ought to be. My own view is it wouldn't take much to change it. I think it would be a change in behavior more than a change of rules. We simply need to get back to dealing with issues and trying to solve problems and get results. I would caution against being overly disappointed by what you see in Washington in a historical sense. One thing I would suggest to you is that next time you see a couple of people shouting at each other on cable television, look and see how many of them have ever been elected to anything. Usually not many. They're just people without a job or not much of a job, and they're hauled up to shout at each other to up the ratings on cable television. Most of the elected people are busy trying to solve problems. Number two, read carefully your political science and history books. The Senate and Washington has never been an easy place to solve problems. The Senate was created to deal with actually the most difficult problems. And we had a vice president who killed a secretary of the treasurer. We had, during George Washington's time, an employee of Thomas Jefferson who was writing scandalous things about Jefferson. We had Sam Houston walking down the street and finding one of President Jackson's critics on Indian policy. He started beating him with a cane. We had a South Carolina congressman who came to the floor of the Senate and nearly beat to death a Massachusetts senator during the Civil War. In World War I, we had Senator Henry Cabot Lodge stand and say of the President of the United States, "I hate that man." We had the Vietnam era and the Watergate era. It's never been easy. The difference is there's so much media today, you see it all the time. And it's hard to get real perspective about it. I find it not very difficult at all to work on issues every day across party lines and to try to get results. I'd like to be able to get more. I'd like for it to be easier, but it's not hard to do, whether it's working on cleaning up mercury in Oak Ridge, having clean air in the Great Smoky Mountains, finding a place to put nuclear waste. I'm part of a group of 45 senators of both parties who have endorsed the Erskine-Bowles, Alan Simpson plan to reduce the debt by $4 trillion, and we're just looking for an opportunity to work with the president to do that. So there's a lot more going on than you might suspect. I don't want to excuse the dysfunction of the Senate, which I think is real, but I would like to put it in a perspective that is more realistic than many people have today. And I'll try not to give such a long answer next time.
First of all, Senator, thank you very much for coming. I really enjoyed this talk.
Thank you.
I was hoping you could clarify something for me between the first and second half of your presentation. The first half was talking about a Manhattan project, the need to really boost R&D spending for finding more and using less, which I think everyone can agree with. But then a part of the second part of your talk, you mentioned about some of the inefficiencies in terms of this alternative energy, the space required for wind turbines, kind of the eyesores, some of the downsides of this new sources of energy. Do you feel that in terms of this Manhattan project that these newer areas should be excluded from funding because you don't see as much potential as, maybe batteries or other sources that you talked about? Can you clarify that for me?
Well, number one, that's a terrific question. Number two, I've rarely had anyone listen to my remarks that carefully, and I thank you for it. I mean, that is, I'm not accustomed to that, and it's a terrific, no, the answer, no, I wouldn't exclude those. In fact, those would be most of the areas where the research should go. I used one example was the research that discovered this way of finding natural gas, and another was batteries. But another is solar. There are only two problems with solar. One is it's too expensive, and one is scale. I mean, you just can't build solar plants. You'd have to cover up half the United States to build solar plants that would be large enough, and it's intermittent. And as today, it mostly can't be stored. But if it could be as low as $1 per kilowatt hour installed, it could go on rooftops and be a supplement to energy. Wind energy might be good offshore, and there are a lot of questions that need to be asked about that. Research is appropriate for that. So those areas do have promise, but it'd take a better battery, cheaper solar to provide it. And it's important to remember that we use so much energy that when wind only provides, after 20 years of very big subsidies, 2% of our electricity, our electricity is going to have to basically come from nuclear power, which is 70% of our clean power, coal, if we can make it clean enough, natural gas, and the renewables altogether aren't going to change very much until maybe 20 years from now.
Thank you.
Senator Alexander, thank
Yes.
you once again for coming. It's ironic that you mentioned energy policy. That's actually something I'm trying to study here at Vanderbilt. And when I've been trying to find courses, I've found that courses that really talk solely and focus solely on energy policy don't exist at the undergraduate level. It seems here at Vanderbilt, and from what I can tell, more generally at most universities. If it's something that you find so important, why is it the case that we haven't, as a country and as a nation, started to actually think about energy policy specifically, not in terms of in relation to other disciplines, and what's something we can do to kind of improve that and focus more on that in the future?
Well, that's a terrific point, and people will often say the United States has no energy policy, and really we have many smaller energy policies, all grouped around the idea of finding more and using less. I suspect the reason you don't find a course on it in undergraduate is because it's a part of American history, it's a part of political science, it's a part of math, geology, for example. So it's a part of so many other courses that maybe the way to study it as an undergraduate is through some sort of interdisciplinary course. I have found over my life that the most interesting issues I can work on today in the Senate are the intersection of energy and environment policy, those two things. And I spend about 40% of my time trying to understand them and figure them out. So maybe some sort of interdisciplinary program or some honors program or some seminars to supplement would be appropriate. But you've got a chair of the political science department right here, and you have other distinguished people around. Maybe they can take your idea and turn it into something.
Thank you.
Hi, I'd like to also reiterate how happy we are to have you to talk about all these issues. My question has to do with another integral part of foreign policy, humanitarian aid. How do you see environmental policy being, as you say, foreign policy, interacting with things that aren't necessarily economically motivated in America's role abroad, particularly human rights violations? Like, how do you think you could address environmental policies connecting to foreign policies to prevent things that are happening like in Libya recently or Syria?
Well, of course, that's, as I just mentioned, our environmental policies come from our desire to have clean air, clean water, healthy lives, and my own view is the best way to get that is to have performance standards and give the producers of the pollutants a long enough time to reasonably get to a result. For example, let's take the getting big trucks in America to get rid of sulfur in diesel fuel. That took 10 years, and in the process, it was a rule that said you have to do it 10 years from now. Started under President Bush, started under President Clinton, ended under President Bush. But here's what happened in the process. Cummins engine developed a completely new engine, which it now sells around the world. It costs more, but it also saves money in fuel efficiency. And so the truckers went along with it, and the government gave the truckers in the industry enough time that they could do it and still not go bankrupt in the process. So environmental policy is often at conflict with energy policy. But when you put them together, you find magnificent results. Like, what do you do about the unused electrical capacity? You come up with plug-in cars. And you find other countries that are going to have to deal with them. Take China. I mean, if you go to Beijing, you have to wear a mask because it's difficult to breathe. They're going to have cleaner air, and if we develop a way to have cheap, clean electricity, cleaner energy, other countries will adopt it. Thank you.
Senator, I wanted to ask you to reflect for just a moment. We have a lot of students here, and talk about a person or a couple of people that have had an influence on your life and on the person that you are today.
Well, that's a nice question to ask. You don't mean just at Vanderbilt, but in general. Well, I met a student, Ari, here tonight, who worked for David Kearns. David Kearns was the head of Xerox, and I persuaded him to come be the deputy education secretary 20 years ago, and he called me up. President Bush sent him to California to deal with the Watts riots, and he called me and said he had the hardest thing to tell me that he ever had, which is he had cancer. And when they developed the cancer, when they cleared up the cancer in his sinus, he lost his eyesight. Well, for 20 years, or until he died, which was 2 or 3 years ago, he had a young man be his sort of seeing eye person. And that person, every one of those young men felt like David Kearns was a wonderful mentor to them during that time. So my suggestion is to students is from the time you graduate and get out in the big real world, those 3 or 4 or 5 years are good times to go to work for people you greatly admire. Don't worry about the pay. Carry their bags. Stay as close to them as you can. Watch how they do things right, how they do things wrong, and do anything legal that they ask you to do. I had a chance to do that for, I'll give you 3 in about 3 minutes. One was when I was in law school, my dean asked me at NYU if I wanted to clerk for John Minor Wisdom in New Orleans. But Judge Wisdom only had one clerk, and he had a guy from Harvard, but he had a messenger's slot open that paid $300 a month. And he said if I'd come be his messenger, he'd treat me like a law clerk. So I did, and he did. And at night I played trombone at your father's mustache on Bourbon Street to make a little extra money, but I had a chance to work with a great man for a year, and I learned a lot from him. The second one was Howard Baker, who was our first Republican senator from Tennessee. I volunteered for his campaign. Eventually, he was elected to my surprise, and I went to Washington and worked with him in literally the same office that I have today, and I learned from him. That's how I got my PhD in politics. And then, almost by accident, I got a chance to be executive assistant was the title when I was about 29 to Bryce Harlow, who was President Nixon's first appointee in the White House. He was his counselor and in charge of congressional relations. And I sat there at a desk next to him and answered his phone and listened to him deal with people. I could tell you stories all night long about learning from what to do and what not to do just because he was so wise. But working for Judge Wisdom, working for Senator Baker, working for Bryce Harlow gave me a grounding about right and wrong and how to deal with things in public life and in private life that I wouldn't trade for even my Vanderbilt education. So I would suggest those kind of mentorships are enormously valuable for students and especially for people right out of an academic setting.
No pressure. Thank you, Senator, for sharing your views, and appreciate your perspective that energy policy is foreign policy, but I'm mindful that education policy is also foreign policy. And I wonder if you could speak at a time when it seems increasingly unlikely that we'll reauthorize the Elementary and Secondary Education Act. How can the United States, at the national level, where do you think it's appropriate for the federal government to have a role in promoting an education system, both at the K-12 and higher education level, that better positions our country going forward economically, which makes us stronger in a foreign policy sense as well?
Well, that's a terrific question, a good way to end. Of course, there's one area where we do pretty well, and that is higher education. And we not only have some of the best colleges and universities in the world, we have almost all of them. And sometimes they get self-satisfied and politically correct, and there are various things we don't like about them and expensive. But the truth is, nobody in the world has anything like our higher education system. We have more problems with K through 12, and the short answer to your question is I'm working hard to reenact the Elementary and Secondary Education Act in Washington. But my view of elementary and secondary education is about 90% of it is parents first and teachers second. And anything that can be done to improve the quality of parents, and you usually can't do that by a law. And second, anything you can do to reward and attract and keep outstanding teachers in the classroom are the two most important things that can be done. So that's why when I was governor, we worked hard to create a master teacher program. Tennessee became the first state to pay teachers more for teaching well. It was controversial, but I can't tell you how many times teachers come up to me today and thank me for the program. 10,000 of them went through the program. They were paid more. They were honored. They got 10, 11-month contracts. And the kids who were in their classrooms got a better teacher. So the federal government can do some things, but in the end, I think kindergarten through the 12th grade is mainly going to be determined by the effort of communities, parents, and teachers in the schools. I went to Maryville High School in East Tennessee, which has won 10 or something straight football championships in the state, but it also was named the outstanding high school academically last year. It's not the richest town in the state. I just saw an interview with the principal during halftime of the football game, and they said, how could Maryville High School be the best academic high school in the state and the best football team in the state? He said, well, I don't know. He says, it's just sort of a town school. Whenever anything happens, everybody shows up. And I think in communities where, Oak Ridge, you might expect it because so many of the parents are PhDs, but in Maryville and places like that where they have extremely good schools, it's usually the result of dedicated long-term efforts by parents and teachers rather than by anything the federal government has done or anything the state government has done. Let me thank you for inviting me tonight. You've been a terrific audience, letting me impose on this subject of foreign policy where you've got so many real experts coming. I'm proud to be a graduate of Vanderbilt University, and I'm proud to be invited to be a part of Impact this year. Thank you very much.